Hello selectors and welcome to another extras video. This one we're going to talk about the current archetypes in Wixoss and just talking about some other kinds of archetypes. This is sort of continuing on from our conversation that we had on the podcast recently, where you really should stop thinking in terms of centers as being the leaders of the deck and more in terms of what archetypes you'll be prepping for. This way you can, your tournament preps, your dailies, your weeklies preps, you can go ahead and start understanding the fundamental types of decks that you'll be playing and how to play around them, or what their strengths and weaknesses are, what exactly they are anyways. You'll be able to recognize them pretty quickly, rather than having to play against a center and then think, oh, I know exactly what the center is, and then getting nuked out of the world because you just had no clue what exactly was in that deck. For example, I've recently played quite a few Tama decks in Wixoss, and while your gut instinct would be that Tama is going to be a mid-range white deck or is going to be a rush aggro white deck, I've seen quite a bit of Tamas that have actually been secretly blue-black mid-range decks. And that's actually something that's worth noting, is that while a lot of these archetypes have kind of trying to avoid using color and nameage completely, a lot of these archetypes don't have to be exactly in specific colors. They can contain certain colors, but that would not necessarily mean that their main ingredients are those colors. It might be their two supporting colors, actually. So let's just jump right into it. The first one that we have is white aggro. Now, white aggro is characteristically defined by a couple things. It's not just, pushing as much damage as humanly possible, like a lot of aggro decks are, but it's characterized by things like Ener denial, right? It's the way that it's going to push damage is minimizing how much Ener it's going to give you to work with while pushing the damage. It often has bounce or trash removal in order to open up lanes to deal damage, and that's a way to Ener deny. It doesn't do a great job at hand denial, but it doesn't really need to. That's not what it's characterized by. Another thing that it's often characterized by is defensive Signi, which is strange, right? You're an aggro deck, your idea is to push damage, and you might think, well, why do I play defensive Signi? Love Dobby is a great example for this. And I've tried to put like a specific card on the side that I think represents the ideals of the archetype. Love Dobby is a pretty good one. It's got an incredible life burst of being able to bounce something with power 10,000 or less for free to the opponent's hand, which means that you can deal damage on your turn when it swings back. But for what it's worth, it's also attacking as a 12 to 14,000 power Signy, and that is very defensive in essence, right? As a 14,000 power Signy, it's tough to Lancer over that. It's tough to hit that with black or red removal. It's just a difficult Signy to deal with. And the idea is it's because it changes combat math, right? If it's up against another aggro deck, it is favored to win against that aggro deck because it changes the combat math, because it makes it difficult for aggro decks to deal easy damage to it, or even mid-range decks to deal easy damage to it. It can extend its game and allow it to play a little bit more of a longer game than most aggro decks can deal with. And that's one of the things that you see down there is it's got reach. It's able to go to mid-game because of that. The other reasons why it can do that in its main deck is because its Lrig deck usually is the one that has all the lane openers. We're talking about things like White Heaven, Ange, assist lines. These are all things that are able to basically subsidize what you need in the main deck to open up with Lrig decks. It's also got a lot of almost unparalleled draw and filtering. White just is very, very, very good at drawing cards and filtering through the deck. Arguably, it could be even better than Blue's access to it, because Blue just straight up draws, while White draws you less. It often draws you the cards you need. And that's something that is pretty impressive. Moving right along, something that's a little bit of an evolution from the white aggro deck is actually a recursion midrange. This is a deck that its main goal is to basically recur value threats over and over and over again. So the premier card for this type of archetype is Super Helesta Saber. Now, the recursion mid-range does not necessarily, just because I'm showing Super Helesta Saber here, need to be a black and white main colored deck. It could be used in blue and black. It can be used in blue and white, for example. And the idea here is basically you're getting a ton of value from the filtering that you have in the deck that white has access to, while also having a ton of filtering because you can take the best guaranteed cards from your trash and bring them to your hand. This is one of the reasons why Super Helesta Saber is just a hallmark for this type of deck. Guards are good. That's something else it also really gets, so it allows it to go really long game. You've got consistent lane opening with both white's bounce and black's smaller removal. And you have a ton of versatile Lrig options. Basically, almost all of the abilities that you could possibly get can be pretty much covered by these two Lrigs. If colors. Like, for example, you need mill, it has access to that. If you need recursion, it has access to that. If you need deck filtering, it has access to that. You need a 3-stop, it has access to that. If you need ways to look at the top 7 cards of your deck and pull something out, it has access to it. Realistic, if you just need straight up lane openers, it's got access to it. Like, between these two colors, you have almost everything that you could possibly want in Wixoss, almost everything you could possibly want. And the cool thing is with Diva, you can splash a 3rd color in there to really get everything that you possibly want in it. Realistically, recursion mid-range is going to be characterized by that like Super Helesta Saber-esque playstyle. I'll often see players playing a little bit longer game and see that they are playing white. They're trying to look like they're bringing their guards back. I already can tell that they're going to have Ana Mirages, Super Helesta Sabers, these types of cards that I'll be looking forward to. The way that I usually play against these is know that these games are going to go to a grind, and I never really overtly push my damage output so that way I can just run out of gas and get blown out, because these decks will be able to grind to basically infinity. Probably should have covered in white aggro what you should be doing against them as well, other than being characteristic by, these Ener denial defensive board states. They have very little in terms of interaction. Often they give up interaction in terms of damage push, which means that you can make some bigger plays to secure yourself wins that white aggro doesn't necessarily have ways to really put stop gaps to those things. So that's how I would play against that one. Moving right along from the mid-range, I thought another one that's kind of similar to it, in the vein of, like, it's got that a lot of white lead sort of cards, is Taxes decks. Taxes decks are pretty actually big in the United States meta, more so than they are in the Japanese meta. Taxes deck right now are characterized by sort of being more of a tempo deck, although they're going to become more of a control deck as time goes on. I thought the Hastalic the Hastalic token was a very characteristic of pretty much everything that these Taxes deck are looking to do. It's just constant draining of resources, right? So I have a phrasing here called discard offensively. And you'll see that I'll actually put that down a bunch. Discard offensively or discard defensively. And these are two different things in Wixoss. They're not the same. Discard offensively is when you basically use discard as a way to promote or push damage. Rather than discard defensively, where you're basically stripping out the resources so they have no ways to basically go long game with you. Taxes decks innately are using their taxes to open up lanes, so it is slightly more aggressive than the normal control deck than you'd think of. And so Discord offensively is doing things like sniping guards out of their hand, or you're very rigorously even giving away some of your own resources to make the opponent go down to 0 hand size, so that way your other tax effects will be beneficial and will work out for you. So you'll see them characterized also by mainly the type of resource denial that they're doing, right? Aside from discarding offensively, having white Ener taxes on various things, really what they're looking to do is do white trash and blue spin. Spin is a term I think we're borrowing from Yu-Gi-Oh! That basically means take something and put it on the top of their deck or put it on the bottom of their deck. It is a really great way to resource deny in the same way that white trash is, but it might be even slightly better than that because it just gets rid of it permanently, no trash effects. It's also looking to refresh your opponents. But the emphasis there is not that the refresh is necessarily dealing damage to your opponent, like a lot of these other refreshes are. There's a lot of ways to deal with refresh, just like discarding can be done offensively, refreshing can be done offensively, it can be done defensively, in this case, in a form of resource denial. By refreshing your opponent, you're actually Ener denying them, so it likes refresh often in terms of just the Ener denial aspect of it. Yeah, and the damage is good too. We can always talk about that. It also has a lot of game extension cards, ways to basically floodgate to make the games go longer, because the more the opponent needs to pay taxes, the less likely they'll have the resources for it, the more likely your taxes will swing the game into your favor. They also will often have ways to guard multiple times. So if they can bring back guards from their trash to their hands, they'll do it. Or they'll often find ways to basically prevent damage, maybe freezing the Lrig, for example, as a form of quote-unquote guard. What you'll need to know is when you're going up a tax deck is that there's really no way around the taxes. This game doesn't really give you ways to deal with taxes. Yes, you can deal with some of them on your turn by removing the issue Signis as you can, but you'll need to basically threat evaluate. Which are the taxes that are going to affect you the most? If you're a green deck, for example, you're probably Ener charging a lot. So you'll need to probably protect your hand more than you'll need to protect your Ener. So these are the ways that you play against the taxes decks. You just accept the fact that you're going to be taxes. You make a priority list in your head, what's more important, rather than trying to deal with every tax that you get as the time goes on, and you pay the taxes that are required. Sometimes you'll skip paying the taxes because you know it doesn't necessarily give them an advantageous position to be in right now, and you can use this later. You can use that that Ener that you're saving later down the line to do damage push. Just know that you're going to go for probably a long game. The complete opposite of a long game, however, is probably your red-based aggro decks. Now, like I said, I'm not necessarily trying to go hard into the colors pies of things, but it's difficult to separate Ener Burn and red from each other. The two are intrinsically linked. In fact, most, and not the cards here that I'm showing, although Diabride does actually show it a little bit here, is that it wants you to be more mono-red than not. This, however, could be a misnomer. A lot of mono-red aggro decks play a fair amount of white or blue cards as well. They just make sure to play them on turns that they won't interact with, for example, Diabride, to allow them to have that mostly mono-red build-up, but they can leverage the other colors' abilities. So don't count it as just mono-red, but I would count it in terms of here are the characteristics that you're going to be looking at. Ener Burn is a big one. You're going to be seeing that they're trying to keep you... the idea here is that if you gather more and more resources as the game goes on, that would be like, I have 7 resources. This puts me at basically turn 4 is where I'm expecting to have those 7 resources. And if you can Ener Burn away 5 of those resources and put them down to 2, it's similar to where they are in turn 2, you're efficiently keeping them from advancing the game state into a direction that is good for them, a later game state, which means that if you were a quote-unquote early deck, it can allow you to run rampant. You are extending the early game longer and putting off the mid and late game by doing this Ener Burn, by basically forcing them into playing smaller Signi, smaller assist rigs, or not even allowing them to grow their assists. That's where the Ener Burn naturally comes in. However, Ener Burn has started to become a little weaker as the Wixoss game has gone on. It's just our players, specifically in the United States, have become really, really good at managing their own resources, and Ener Burn becomes more difficult. Where Ener Burn is going to live or die moving forward is going to be less on removing all the Ener from their thing, but knowing that their assist Lrigs are going to cost 5 Ener, and the correct move is to keep them off of 5 Ener, put them on 4 Ener for 3 turns in a row, so that way they'll never be able to use their assist Lrig to their maximum potential. That's really where red aggro lives in, and it requires a bit more understanding of the game than what I think people are giving it credit for. It also is going to have a lot more interactionless Signi. This is sort of Tengu is the example here. This is cards that are just like, they're difficult to deal with. In Tengu's case, it can not only gain Assassin, which makes it hard to wall out, but it also can't be downed by your opponent's effects if you're using it right. And red is going to, and specifically this type of aggro, is going to more and more rely on using these at the right time. Like I said, you've got to be kind of smart to run aggro now. You'll need to know what your opponent is playing so you can counteract them. The issue is, in order to pack redundancy, which red kind of needs, you'll need to play like a lot of these, and they might not be great in certain matchups. That's where often blue or white comes in to help filter it a little bit, or black to help filter it a little bit. The other characteristic is basically it's going to lane open you every time. Its goal is to lane open, and it's going to do almost the maximum amount of damage every turn. The other thing that it's going to be trying to do is burst damage, right? It's going to be looking to do 5 to 6 damage a turn instead of the regular 3 to 4 damage a turn. When you're playing against this type of deck, seeing all these characteristics, you're going to want to understand that sometimes you're going to need to take 3 damage in order to survive a 6 damage turn, right? Sometimes you might hold off, and this is the classic case with Nobunaga here, is that you might hold off on taking, you might have the Madoka Clap, and you might hold off on surviving 3 damage because all your lanes are open, because you know they're going to go for a Nobunaga turn. And when they go for that Nobunaga turn, it's much, much, much more valuable to have the Madoka Clap in that area to tap down the Nobunaga and survive the extra double crush. So the way to play against these red aggro decks is be very sparse with your Ener, and understand that you're going to need to do less greedy things like spells that draw you cards, while simultaneously knowing that you've got to protect against the burst damage turns, not necessarily just the open damage turns. Remember, anytime they can only deal 2 damage, that's basically a win for you, even if it doesn't feel like it. Because the longer game you go, the harder it is for them to really do these burst damage turns, and the more likely it is that you can outlast them. We have blue-red tempo. I also put a little black in there as well. This is sort of just your tempo, your normal tempo deck. I have not seen this tempo deck exist in any other colors than blue and red primarily, with a little splash of black so far, which is why I'm categorizing it as blue-red tempo. And it basically does the same thing that the mono red deck does, but it just extends it a little bit more. It does a little less damage in the early games, but it gives you more access to card draw, as well as access to all the forms of disruption that your opponent that would be good for your opponent. That's going to be red's Ener Burn, blue's discard, and black's mill in some cases. Even that case being also maybe black's assassin with red, so that way you can punch damage regardless of what your opponent's doing, like, for example, if they put an Exia out. This is sort of like the premier colors when you think of aggro. Yes, white also is a thing that you can do to make aggro really push, but realistically it ends up, if you play white-red aggro, it just basically ends up being this red aggro that we were talking about here with a white bounce splash to it. To either strengthen the burn, sort of the Ener Burn ideal by using some Ener denial effects, or it helps push more aggro for that burst damage. This has got a little bit of a different thing to it. This is a bit more like I hinder my opponent while also forwarding my own game plan, right? I put my opponent down 1 pip of tempo, put me up 1 pip of tempo. That gives us 2 degrees of separation. That's stronger than if me just trying to put all my eggs in my own basket here. It also extends the amount of game that you can go for, right? Aggro, especially red aggro, burns out very quickly. By adding blue, you lower its damage output, but you do increase its chance of being able to hit those damages longer term, and not get completely shut out by some like floodgating-esque Lrigs. It also ends up being pretty good with its burst damage as well, just because it can plan around those turns, and if one turn its burst damage doesn't work out like the aggressive red deck does, then you might be able to recover, get yourself another Nobunaga, move forward with that sort of burst damage turn, get a second shot at it. Another different type of almost red deck is Stompy. Now, Stompy is a bit different than the red deck. In fact, it's very almost interactionless. The idea here is that you're putting almost all of your eggs in your aggressive basket. However, you get a lot of things that you don't normally get, which is easy resources, right? One of the things that kind of caps how much red damage can do a turn is its Ener. It only gets a certain amount of Ener per turn, and if your opponent's playing less aggressive and Ener starving, you can actually be pretty effective to slowing red down to playing at your rate of the game. Stompy kind of fixes that just by going like, no, when this attacks, it Ener charges, and then I can pay Ener, and it removes the thing in front of it. So it ends up being very much like a linebacker in a football game where it's just pushing its way through. The other thing that it has is between green's ability to pull cards out of its own Ener and put it into your hand, and red's ability to discard cards to draw cards, it actually has pretty good filtering, often free filtering where it doesn't really cost you much. Blue will cost you something to basically draw your extra cards. Red green doesn't really do that. They give you an ability to just sort of push your own damage, and then sort of like shuffle yourself to where you're trying to get. It's not amazing, and you're usually not gaining card advantage off of it, but you are equally exchanging resources for it. It also has premium removal. Red excels at removing small Signi. Green excels at removing large Signi. Together, they basically run over anything that you could put in front of them. It even has ways to deal with things that red just normally has problems with, like Exia, by having Lancer and being able to push through the damage, or even like being able to mid attack remove Exia, so that way you still at least get in one damage that turn. It has a strong mid game. Green gives red a bit more longevity than it normally would have by having some stronger level 3s than red has access to, and can even put down some things that stick around for a while, which actually makes it more difficult for your opponents to just counterplay your aggression. The next one that's sort of like a red aggro-esque deck, although it really tarries the line between aggro and mid-range, is what I call recursion aggro. This is actually going to be, if you play a lot of DXM, this is where DXM's like happy place is. And that's why we see Trigger Victory here. The main thing that categorizes it, though, right, because DXM isn't the only one that plays this. Sometimes Lion Cosmos plays this, and again, this is an example of a white center that actually isn't a white deck. It is a red and black deck. Cosmos is a red and black deck, often led by Lion, which is a white Lrig. Musica often also plays the same sort of thing. So does Hirana Midrange, sort of plays this same sort of game, where really the goal is to recur silver bullets in your deck. You're using red's really strong but limited Signi that might be immune to tapping down, or might be immune to basically being told it can't attack by white's effects. And you are using less of those Signis, right? They're silver bullets. But because black has access to mill and recursion, you see them at a higher rate and can bring the correct ones that you need to your hands better. It also has access to premium early removal lane openers. Between red's ability to vanish X and under, and black's ability to give X minus X, you really are going to constantly be able to churn out damage as needed. It also has access to Assassin, and actually has access to better burst damage than most aggro decks do. Not only do you get the red double crush, but usually once per game you're also going to be able to mill your opponents out for extra damage, right? And this is where Trigger Victory really comes in handy. You see Trigger Victory basically does all of the things that I said here, which is why DXM is really, really good, but it is not a brain deck type of deck. You have to sort of know how to play with it and how to play against it in order to survive it against a really strong recursion aggro opponent. I think recursion aggro is probably one of the stronger versions of aggro in Wixoss, just because it really has the ability to just take advantage of everything that aggro has to offer, and then just keep it up, keep that momentum going forward. And Wixoss innately is a momentum-based game. So how do you deal with against recursion aggro? Well, one of the ways that you can do it is it actually can be beneficial to refresh them, right? By removing the ability for them to really use their silver bullets effectively, you will be able to really mess with them. Another thing that you can do that like kind of messes with them early on is if you do early disruption. We're talking Ener disruption and card disruption, so making them discard cards. You kind of force them into having to use up their gas recursion sooner in order to maintain their early game presence, and it can be beneficial as a way to take this deck down. Likewise with Stompy. Stompy is just generally not... It's an okay deck, but generally it's doing the same game plan throughout the whole thing. So you can kind of just employ your own game plan, and because they won't really have any real good way to stop you from moving forward with it. So you can just sort of outpower the Stompy deck. With this, You don't necessarily outpower it, but you do have a way to disrupt it. Moving on here, we've got discard midrange. Now, to be clear here, this is one of the first ones where you're going to see two main colors, right? And this one being blue and black for it, but you can do it in two different ways, and they're very, very similar. You'll notice that I said discard midrange, and then the next slide is going to be discard control. And they are different, but they share a lot of cards and Venn diagram differently. It's a lot more about the game state and the actions that you're using with it than it is about the actual cards that you're playing with. So the deck may be 30 cards. The main deck may be 30 cards of the same thing, and may share, you know, 9 of the same Lrig decks. So how is it that these are two effectively different decks? And that's because the last bit of space flavors it differently to do a different function, just slightly. And that how you play it out can be majorly different. So the discard midrange discards offensively, whereas the discard control deck that I'm going to talk about discards defensively. What does discarding offensively mean? Well, it means that it doesn't really care if the opponent has cards in their hand on their turn. It just cares that on the owner's turn, this player's turn, who's playing the discard midrange, they have 0 cards when they go into their attack phase. The idea is that will strip guards out of their hand, and it will strip likely plays that they might be able to do. For example, Madoka Clap's discarding effect or something. Or if they have something that's attacking and says, but this attack can be stopped by discarding, well, they have no cards in hand to discard it to stop, so it won't happen. This is what discarding offensively innately does. It also uses black's, it really leans heavily on black's lane opening, since blue does not really give it much. And it uses black's refresh. The refreshing kind of disrupts the natural turn order, right? It Ener deprives and also gives the opponent, who is probably using their trash as some form of value, it just like denies them the ability to do that. But black's refresh really here is mostly to push more damage. And it uses blue deck fixing. So it allows itself to keep the beats going into the late game, into the mid game, by using blue deck fixing. You'll often see these decks, for example, forego life bursts that help push damage or mitigate damage for more resource gathering. And that's because innately they're using their resources faster than the control deck was, so they need ways to replenish their resources. It's less to make them go long game and more to ensure that they have what they need on the turns that they're playing it. I think Minimin is a really great example of this. Minimin discards their own resources to do very early and hard to disrupt discard for the opponent. So I often, if I see the opponent playing Minimin, that is almost a sure guaranteed sign that they're a discard midrange. And we'll talk about, like, again, they're looking for ways to pose damage, and they'll take it in any way that it comes. So often you'll see Lrigs that mill the opponent as a discard midrange strat, because they'll be using mill as a way to deal more damage. Or you'll see things like Tama, which allows you to do more Lrig damage as another way for discard midrange to work. It just pushes that damage in a mid-range sense, whereas Control sort of leans back and doesn't care how long the game's going. They're controlling the flow of the game, so that way inevitably they'll win. And that's the difference between the two of them, really, is that we'll still see lane opening in black. We'll see discarding defensively. The idea here is that you want your opponent to have as little cards on their turn as possible, because it limits the amount of options the opponent can play, to the point where they may even be playing, for example, Madoka Dub or something here, which then limits the amount of options your opponent has to play against you, because the longer the game goes on, the more likely it is you're going to win. This is why ZR is here instead of Minimin. ZR gives you sort of everything that you're looking for here. Not only does it have ways to kind of open up lanes, and it's less powerful ways to open up lanes, but a way to do it, it also allows this player to draw a card or make the opponent discard a card. The draw actually matters there, because you need to extend the game. You need to make sure that just because you're blowing resources to keep your opponent out from playing the game, the only way that this becomes your favored is if you are also regaining more resources than you're spending. blue-black disc mid-range is more likely to spend resources for parity than Control is. Control's looking to gain more resources per what they spend than not. It also has a lack of damage output, really, and it uses that black refresh as more of a main way to deal damage. This is something to keep in mind when you're playing against it, because you might need to understand you shouldn't be blowing through, drawing your deck as much as possible against these, because if you can deprive them from the mill, you may be depriving them from crucial turn-winning plays because they won't be able to damage you as easily. This means that you do have more time to get to the game win against Control than you do against mid-range. Mid-range is going to put a clock on you and eventually kill you if you're not moving the game forward. Control actually is one of its weaknesses is because it does go long game. It allows you to recover and go back in so long as you don't blow your resources all at once. That's another thing that you got to do against discard Control that you can maybe get away with discard mid-range, is that you do need to not overextend when you're playing against discard Control specifically. And you'll see also I put defensive Signi on here. Sometimes you might splash white or something into it in order, or even have white as your main Lrig here, so that way you can be a little bit more defensively. For example, maybe you're playing the Nova deck, so that way you can recur your guards, or you're playing Exia, you're playing some white to play Exia. Going on to black aggro, this is one of the archetypes that's starting to emerge and exists and is a real thing, and I think you should know how to play against it, even if it's not what I consider the strongest thing that you can be doing right now. That doesn't mean that it won't get cards later down the line, and it won't come out of nowhere on you. Wixoss is a very random game where people play very random decks, so you're more rewarded knowing the entire metagame than you are not. And I think black aggro basically can do this, where it uses mill as damage. Now, I recently played against a mill deck that used basically black aggro, three types of black Lrigs, to mill me almost 3 times. It almost refreshed me 3 times, which is crazy. I can barely, in my current bang deck, refresh the opponent once. So milling someone out 3 times is pretty nuts. The way that it's going to do mill as damage, and I have Pouncer Trash here, that shouldn't be there. That's a typo on my end. I should have just deleted it. It's just mill as damage. Basically, it's going to try to push forward damage as much as possible, do those 3 lane openings, but a lot of the cards will also incidentally mill the opponent, and it adds up after a while. Like, you see those, like, 4 on attack, 4 on attack, 4 on attack, 4 on attack. You do that 4 times, and that ends up being, 12 to 16 cards. That it can be a huge number, especially if you have a lot of cards in your hand and a lot of cards in your Ener that you're not necessarily spending. That mill can add up. It also has free removal. Black is one of the only colors that just gets access to weaker removal, but removal nonetheless, right? Lucifer is a good example here, where if you support it correctly, you can do negative 6,000 to things. And that's pretty big, right? And if you have 2 Lucifers on the field, that's 2 negative 6,000s. That means it's a free 1-lane opener, but often probably a free 2-lane openers. And it uses the trash as an extended hand like no other, right? A lot of those things that mill your opponent can also mill yourself. So should you need to just have an extended trash, you can do that with this type of deck. I think it's actually pretty strong. What I would say is, if you recognize that this is what's happening, often black aggro needs a lot of black to function, so you'll often see 2 black Lrigs or 3 black Lrigs. Something that I would do is I'd get more of a fire under my butt to spend my Ener, and that's one of the ways that you can kind of depower the mill that it has, because once it refreshes you, all of that stuff that you spent on your Ener go to the trash, and you can refresh it, you reshuffle, and now you have more of a deck, which makes it tougher for them to mill you down to 0 again. I've seen a lot of people get refreshed, have 10 to 12 cards in their Ener because they're trying to save it up for a late game push or something, and then just get refreshed again because their deck is like 20 cards big. So that's something that I would do to play around it. I also sort of just ignore, like, I just go on to the understanding that my Signi will never live a turn, and being defensive is pretty stupid as well. So what I do is I lean on my assist Lrigs to basically save me, or sometimes my life bursts. I'll often let more early damage go just so again, that damage can then turn into Ener, and that Ener then can go into my trash, and then that when that gets refreshed means it's less chance for them to mill me out so easily. Um, but also because then a well-timed life burst can shut black aggro down. It really doesn't have a great ways. It has a lot of ways to push proactive damage. Doesn't have a lot of great ways to stop damage on your end. Especially if they're focusing a lot on their mill game plan. So you'll be able to do that to sort of punish them from not having a very balanced deck. The next one, this is more recent, is the Rock, right? And this I'm borrowing this from a Magic the Gathering term. You could think of this more as Jund if you played a lot of Magic the Gathering, and that would be pretty efficient too. It ends up being this like very kind of like consistent deck where it's really difficult to disrupt, right? It's almost discard proof. Not that you can't discard it, but it's just like they'll always have cards in their hands. They're going to start almost every turn with 6 cards in their hand. You can discard them down to 3, but then their hand size is just going to go back up again. And that's leveraging black and green's innate ability to bring cards back from the trash to their hand or bring cards back from the Ener to their hands. And it's just got a lot of ways to just constantly refuel. It's actually really difficult to handle. And the blue-black effects, generally speaking, are some of the more powerful effects that you'll run into Wixoss. They just often cost quite a bit. I'm cheating a little bit here because you'll notice the bottom 2 are Japanese cards that you can't read, but they're a combo. They basically are something called a Venom combo that are be coming out in this set coming out in February. And the effects more or less state that you can pay an Ener, bring a card back from your Ener zone to your hand or field. The black is the same thing. You bring a card back from your trash to your hand or field. And then that last effect that the level 3 can do is if it's at a certain band, if it's at 20,000 power, you can basically give it negative 10,000 to give your opponent's Signi negative 10,000. Meaning that between black and blue, you have a lot of ways to just push damage regardless of what your opponent's doing. Oh, cool, they've got an Exi out, that's fine. You have you have Lancer. Oh, cool, they have this 15,000 remember. That's fine. Osagetsu gets rid of that no matter what, as do most of the life bursts there too. Oh, what's that? They've got some kind of a thing that you can't target. Green has access to some ways to just take it from the field and put it in the Ener zone directly, so it doesn't technically leave the field through vanishing. Like these types of things are sort of the niche things that black and green do together. Energy Door is another really good example of how it's just difficult to disrupt, right? Using Energy Door, you can either pay basically 3, or you can use the first one, which gets you 2 Ener, to rebate it to basically 1 Ener. And you get the various effects. You can either Ener charge 2 from your trash, you can draw 2 cards, you can vanish a level 3 or more Signi on your opponent's field, or you can basically say the next damage that you would get during your opponent's turn from their Lrig, you don't get it, which is even better than putting a guard back to your hand because it's discard proof, right? Like it doesn't matter if the opponent discards a guard. Okay, you were never doing that. This was going to stop their Lrig damage no matter what, regardless of the guard. So this is sort of how the Rock plays. It's actually weirdly counter meta in the fact that a lot of the time you'll be seeing with these red decks, right? And that's another thing too, is the red decks are Ener burning you, and you're like Ener charging all the time. So you're like, I don't really care that you're Ener burning me. You're taking away my excess Ener, but I'm still able to function very well right now. The blue decks are making you discard cards, and you're like, I don't really care. I'm drawing those cards from my trash or my Ener zone. The white decks are putting defensive Signi out there, and you're like, I don't really care. I've got Lancer. It's sort of a catch-all answer. I've got Black's Assassin sometimes. It's a catch-all answer. So it ends up being very, very difficult to disrupt and sort of plays against what your opponent's decks are. Its weaknesses, however, are if you're not one of those decks, right? If you're just a deck like that's just doing like that, it also shuts down the taxes decks because it also like doesn't really care about the taxes. But if you're like, for example, one of these recursion red decks where you're not really focusing on Ener Burn, you're just focusing on doing burst damage. This doesn't really have a way to deal with that. Like, yes, it has probably the normal floodgates that the other decks would have, but it doesn't have really disruption in that respect to shut you down, so you can play solitaire against them and really win. It would be difficult to also win against a lot of combo-esque types of decks with the Rock, because, again, it's really good at beating the interactive decks, just by being so bluntly difficult to interact with, but it has struggles with the decks that lack interaction and have more power instead, because that's not what it's tuned to beat. Then following that, we have combo here. So I've got combo down as a deck, and it's not a super strong archetype in Wecross, but there's about 2 different combo decks that exist in Wecross right now, and as the sets go on, there actually is more combo decks that exist, where they do things like recur a couple cards and fuse them together to make an insane fusion monster in Wecross. That's currently happening in the Japanese meta. There's a lot of things where it's like, oh, well, this is dependent on you having a complete or revealing some amount of virtuals. So these combo decks do exist. They kind of are somewhere between synergy decks and combo decks. But they are very strong in Wecross for a very specific reason, right? Often combos are A plus B decks, and in other card games, that's difficult to use because A plus B decks, when you are shuffling all of your cards together, you can draw all your A cards and none of your B cards, or all of your B cards and none of your A cards, right? And some combos require A plus B plus C. In Wecross, you have the Lrig deck, which means that you can make your combo exist a lot more easier. For example, an Endless Punchline requires your deck to be basically thinned out of all of the level 1s and 2s and just be nothing but spells and level 3s in your deck. So where this really rocks is that you can basically make your entire main deck the A portion, right? Which is filter. And then your B portion can just be your Endless Punchline hanging out in your Lrig deck to pull out at any time as possible, which means that it means that you have to take up less slots to do stuff. Some main deck combos in Wecross really are just like, if this Signi and this Signi are next to each other, then they work, which means that they take up anywhere from 6 to 8 slots in your main deck, meaning that they are, yes, dedicated space, but not something you need to warp your deck around. Combo decks also can really benefit from this game specifically because there's a lot of lack of on the stack, on the chain, on the bucket interaction in Wecross, right? Like, it is mostly solitaire, which means that you are incentivized to put together these combo or synergy pieces sometimes. This is one of the reasons why I think the game lacks a lot of combo pieces, is because they're pretty well aware that is a recipe for disaster later down the line. So I think they avoid it. But I think enough pieces are present so that you can make combo-esque decks work. When you're playing against a combo deck, it is incredibly important to recognize what the combo is, right? Sometimes, and this is something that I remember in the second ceremony that would happen, I would play against a white-black deck, and I would see one random combo piece, right? And you look at that combo piece, and you know it's a combo piece because that card's probably bad, normally played, and you see it, and you just have to automatically assume they're on the combo. So the only way that you are able to then defend against these things, to know not how to get bursted down by a flurry of attacks now that these combo pieces have been put together, is to hold the few interaction pieces that you have, right? Against Endless Punchline, one of the ways to beat the combo pieces is refresh them. If you refresh them, it takes away all their hard work that they've done, and you end up with a deck that's not filtered, and the Endless Punchline is going to be random again. Something that I would often do when I was playing a lot of blue spin removal is I would actually spin a lot of the level 1s from the card jockey deck to the bottom of the opponent's deck. Therefore, it would be safe there. They'd have to go through their entire deck again in order to get it out, and it would basically ruin their chances at hitting Endless Punchline consistently. So there are ways to deal with combo. The other way that you can deal with combo is just plow through it, right? It takes them a little while to set up their combo. If you know when that's likely to go off and you can't manage a defense, just manage a very strong offense to push through it. Maybe even force them to use the combo early and potentially for less effectiveness. The last one that I want to talk about a little bit here is Tribal. Now, Tribal could theoretically go under combo, but I really don't think that's the way it works in Wixoss. In Wixoss, Tribal ends up just being kind of a vehicle to make existing archetypes easier. So for example, the Atomic archetype is just discard midrange, and the Terra Beast archetype is just Stompy. Understanding that these are the underlining decks that these packages or archetypes these deck types themselves make allow you to deal with them easier without having to get specific in the what do I deal with Adams situation, right? So Adams, for example, converts a lot of their hand into opening lanes, more than the average blue-black deck can do, which is why it ends up being a better discard midrange, generally speaking, than just a discard midrange in a vacuum. Knowing that, you can use that to your advantage and try to hand strip them a little bit more, and then that'll cause them to not be able to be so efficient with their resources. Terra Beasts often gain their power by having a lot of team pump on their stuff, and if their field is bigger, then they can do stuff. So you might not be able to stop the damage, but you will be able to stop the abilities by using your black Lrig to give negative effects to things, right? To dispower how good their Lancer is, for example. But at the end of the day, if you take the same sort of sensibilities that you're running towards discard midrange Stompy, you'll be able to be fine with these types of tribal decks. Now, there's a lot of tribal decks, right? There's Cosmos decks, there's Angels, right? And Angels is an interesting one because Angels is often either sort of a rock deck, or with green and black and blue, or it's a sort of recursion package deck, and that's a weird one because it's not in red at all. It's usually in blue and black, or it's a aggro deck in terms of it's mostly like the red aggro deck. So you can't just make a call looking off of the Signi type and know exactly what it is. But again, often against those types of decks where I'm looking at it and in the blind, because Wixoss is weird, right? People bring weird decks often against you. You may not know how to deal with it, but if you know the underlining ways to deal with archetypes in general, you'll then be able to use that information as a loose guidepost to help allow you to go through that game and probably still be successful. Also, it's worth mentioning that we have a lot of centers in Wixoss. This is the quintessential argument that started the whole idea of having this talk in the first place, is that we have a lot of centers in this game. We have a lot of similar but slightly different assists and pieces in this game. But generally speaking, these overall arching archetypes will be able to get you a path to victory, to know how to play against your opponents. And also you can use this in deck building to be like, how do I make my thing work the best it possibly can? What does it innately like? Oh, my thing taxes my opponent. Maybe I should be thinking about being a tax deck, but maybe I shouldn't be a tax deck. Maybe I should be a recursion mid-range deck, right? And this will allow you to help sort of guidepost your own deck building. There will be more archetypes that come in existence in Wixoss right now. The only thing that I've chosen here is the stuff that's in set 7 and below right now, at least that I can visibly see. And I think we'll get more archetypes as times go on. I think there's probably a blue-green archetype I really haven't covered that's something more like akin to Big Stompy, right? Where it's not just red Stompy, but the idea is I'm going late game and I'm going to keep putting problematic Signi out all the time. I think there's elements there that could exist that just aren't the recipe. The right ingredients aren't quite there to make a really successful deck. But I think this will get your brain going and learning exactly. Maybe I should think more in terms of archetypes in Wixoss rather than in centers in Wixoss. What's your favorite archetype? Tell me about that. If you've learned anything more about archetypes and it's sort of made things click for you, let me know in the comments down below. Also, what are some archetypes that you've seen in other games maybe that you think could exist here? For example, I'd like to see a burn deck in Wixoss. I think we have something that's coming down the line in almost set 11 or 9 that will allow for more of like a burn archetype to exist in Wixoss, but we don't really have that right now.